Hello, everyone. My name is Michele Lancione, and I'm co-director with Abdul Simon of the Beyond Inhabitation Lab. And I'm here in Turin today with three of my colleagues. We have Mara Ferreri, Rodrigo Castriota, and Deborah Waldman. And we are here today to listen to another one of our colleagues, Dr. Irene Peano. She's one of the members of the lab as a steering committee member. So I am going to introduce Irene, and then Irene is probably going to talk for about 40-45 minutes, and we will have time for Q&A in a bit. Now, Irene holds a PhD in social anthropology from the University of Cambridge, and she's a researcher fellow at the Institute of Social Sciences at the University of Lisbon, and a member of the lab, as I just said. Her work is focused on labor and migration, with particular reference to sexual and agricultural work across Italy, Nigeria, and Eastern Europe, through methods which place long-term engagement and solidarity at the center of her research. Currently, she's working on a manuscript which investigates the material, spatial, symbolic, and affective stratifications of mobility and labor control, and the forms of resistance against them, by reference to the development of Italian agrocapitalism in two of Italy's agro-industrial enclaves, the Apulian Tavoliere and the Plain of Gioia Tauro. Now, today, Irene is giving a paper, or a presentation anyway, entitled Made in Italy, Contemporary Archaeologies of Agribusiness, Encampment, Archipelago. We are all very excited to have you here, Irene. So I leave it to you, and the floor is yours, and I will share my screen as agreed.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Michele, and all the members of the lab for your work, for the admin work as well. This is, I have changed the title of the presentation slightly to, this is very much work in progress that's taken quite a long time to come to fruition. Hopefully it will soon. As you mentioned, this is a manuscript project. So what I'm going to do today is to try and present an overview of what I think are the main arguments by means of a few examples. Of course, I cannot go into too much detail, and probably the presentation is already too long. So please just tell me to shut up if I talk too much. But yes, so in general, I guess, genealogies is a better description of what or material genealogies is a better description than archaeologies for what I'm trying to do. But again, this is very much work in progress, and any feedback is most welcome. So, as Michele mentioned, this is in part the result of over 10 years of engaged research in two of Italy's main agribusiness districts. It's research that has, again, relied on participatory engaged methods that supported the demands of racialized migrant workers, both sex workers and farm laborers, who live in what I have defined as the encampment archipelago. And I'll come back in a second to what I mean by that. But let's have a very quick look at where these two districts that I will be talking about are. So next slide, please. The first is Tavoliere delle Puglie, is also called Capitanata. It's the more or less coincides with the district of Foggia in the southeast of Italy. This is the second largest stretch of arable land in Italy, and it currently employs tens of thousands of migrant farm workers for open field vegetable cultivation, as well as the harvest of grapes and olives. Next, please. The other districts I'm talking about is in the southernmost tip of the Italian peninsula, Calabria. It's called the Plain of Gioia Tauro. This slide, the image I chose comes from a humanitarian organization's reports that therefore also kind of details some of the encampments that dot these districts, although these change very often, as you will see, so this is already a bit dated. But so this is home to mostly citrus and olive groves, and it's a smaller area that concentrates, whose peak for harvest is reached in wintertime, and employs some 6,000 migrant workers, more or less. The obviously figures are very difficult to estimate due to large reliance on so-called grey and black labor, i.e. irregular, undocumented labor. Next slide, please. So I'll be, first of all, introducing the notion of the encampment archipelago, which I have already elaborated on in an article that I put the reference for here because I don't think I have time to go into much detail. But basically, we're looking at a series of settlements that kind of acquire different shapes and forms, not only geographically differentiated, but also mutating in time, as we will see, and that range from very heavily surveilled camp-like spaces to more open, self-constructed, autonomous spaces, slum-like. But usually there's a lot of hybrid kind of in-between mutations between these two poles, as it were. I call it an archipelago not only because there are structural similarities between these different spaces across different districts in Italy, not just the two I'm looking at more specifically, but also because there is a high level of interchange of the population between them. These are, on the one hand, recruitment hubs for farm labor and places for the cheap reproduction of the farm labor force, and therefore care services are offered often for a fee, including sexual labor. But they are also nodes for along migratory routes that start mostly in West Africa and spread across the Sahara onto Northern Africa and Western Europe. Each of these encampments has its peculiarities. So what I'll do now is try and single out a few of those, the ones that I'll be mostly talking about, and describe some of them in some detail. So next slide, please. The first encampment that I want to talk about is called Borgo Tre Titoli. It's located in the district of Foggia, so in Tavoliere. It's also known as Campagna by its inhabitants. Campagna means countryside. Its inhabitants are mostly Ghanaian, and they sometimes call the place Ghana House or Ghana Ghetto. This is probably the oldest surviving encampment in Tavoliere, together with the so-called Grand Ghetto that I'll be talking about in a second. According to its older residents, it was established sometime in the 1990s. It is also the one encampment that changed the least through the decades. Located in the southern part of the district, not far from the large agro town of Cerignola, it is nested in a rural borgata that can roughly translate as hamlet, established in the 1950s as part of the agrarian reform. And you can see in the left-hand side picture the kind of more broad aerial view that this kind of rectangle is more or less sort of the shape of the settlement as it was given by the planners of the agrarian reform, more or less. It's not really a center of any kind. It's made up of sparse rural houses. And I'm very well aware of the kind of problems with this sort of bird eye view, but I'm also very conscious of taking pictures in these kinds of places, so I usually avoid it. And I think looking at these from space, as it were, is useful in kind of getting a sense of what they are. So for centuries, this was a stopping station for transhumant shepherds called posta in technical language, part of the Kingdom of Naples' royal domain. But then after the alienation of land that began during the Napoleonic periods and was completed with the proclamation of the Kingdom of Italy in 1861, it became one of the core farms, locally called masserie, of the Pavoncelli family estate. Hailing from Cerignola, in the earlier part of the 19th century, the Pavoncellis had amassed great wealth as wheat traders. In the late 1950s, the land was then confiscated by the Reform Agency and parceled out into small plots given out to tenants, some of whose descendants today still hold rights to them. Most of the houses built during the reform were never inhabited by its beneficiaries, and this is true here as elsewhere. And as we will see, there's other settlements with this kind of pattern. However, the beneficiaries maintain control over them, and in many cases charge rent to the current occupiers, the migrants, sometimes to be paid in kind by means of free labor. Next slide, please. Here we have two videos. I don't know, Michele, if you can manage to play them. These are very amateurish kind of attempts to sort of, to get moving images. So the first one shows you the development of Grand Ghetto from 2002 until 2015, the one on the left. And then the one on the right gives you a sense of how it's changed from 2017 till 2019. And finally, in the bottom right, you have a more recent picture, I think from 2019 as well. But basically, so like other encampments in this archipelago, including Tre Titoli that I just spoke about, the Grand Ghetto began as a seasonal dwelling to then become progressively more permanent. As Borgo Tre Titoli, the ghetto took shape starting from the semi-abandoned premises of an agrarian reform-era settlement, carved out of a large estate, originally named Torretta Antonacci. Neither settlement is provided with running water, but the Grand Ghetto also lacks any connection to the electrical grid. It is said to have been established after the evacuation of a former sugar plant nearby, where migrant farm workers had found refuge during harvest times. As with all ghettos, it also developed into a space of leisure with bars, restaurants, and so-called connection houses, mostly Nigerian-run brothels, as well as clothing and food stores, sometimes also offering other services like photocopying. But unlike Borgo Tre Titoli, the Grand Ghetto has undergone heavy mutations, as you saw in the animations through the last few decades, which beside its mere expansion, were mostly the consequence of state intervention. A partial eviction was enforced in 2017. And so you see kind of that sort of empty area in the top right picture, which was previously constructed. This was enforced by means of a large-scale police operation during which a fire erupted due to unascertained causes that killed 2 residents in their sleep and destroyed a large portion of the slum. The portion that, according to the authorities, lay on land belonging to the regional government of Apulia. A new slum where shacks have been partially substituted by caravans and brick-and-mortar houses developed on the nearby grounds, while in 2019 the regional authorities established first a tent and then a container city, now largely unmaintained, in the section that had been razed to the ground after the fire. So then we go to the next slide, even more kind of makeshift artisanal slides, sorry. Another video here. Yes, this is currently the largest encampment of its kind in Italy. And the genealogy of the ghetto that sprawls around an asylum seeker reception center formerly established in 2005 near the hamlet of Borgo Mezzanone, south of Foggia, is also among the most emblematic and intricate. Originally, as you see from the shape, it was an airstrip built by the US forces in the heart of Tavoliere during the Second World War. And then after unsuccessful proposals to turn it into NATO base and then into a cargo airport, and following decades of abandonment, since 1999, caravans first and later containers were laid out alongside one of its runways by the Ministry for Internal Affairs. These house asylum seekers first from Kosovo, then from the Horn of Africa and West Africa. With the establishment of the center in 2005, those first facilities were excised from the official camp by means of a fence, hence the name Mexico. Eviction was threatened, to which inhabitants successfully resisted. In 2008, they also obtained the addition of further prefabricated structures to meet the needs of the ever-growing population of rejected asylum seekers who were being progressively expelled from the official camp. Adjacent to the center's fence perimeter and to the main airstrip where containers had been placed, a large slum, known to some of its longer-term inhabitants as Mexico precisely, has sprawled in the past decades, and especially after the partial eviction of the Grand Ghetto in 2017. So indeed, there is kind of an interchange of population between the different ghettos, also as a result of evictions and not only as a result of the needs of seasonal farming. The Italian authorities have been planning to reconvert the reception center into a camp reserved for regularly employed migrant farm laborers, following the only partially and temporary successful blockage of arrivals along the central Mediterranean route that started in 2017. Renewed bilateral agreements between Italy and Libya led to a significant reduction in the number of guests, as asylum seekers are called in official language, and to a projected dismantling of the center that, however, is yet to come, also due to the reopening of maritime migration routes. In the meantime, during the COVID pandemic, new containers were installed, and again, I don't know if it's very clear from the images, but you can see differences between the kind of layout of the prefabricated structures as well, though it's perhaps not so easy to kind of get what these are. So during the COVID pandemic, new containers were installed to host quarantine migrants according to a differential racialized logic that also fostered practices of corruption and bribing between entrepreneurs and local politicians, which later came to the surface. In the summer of 2023, the containers were repurposed to house a few unofficial dwellers of the decaying prefabricated structures located inside the center's perimeter. So there's a very complex kind of play between control and institutional abandonment here, in a topography where legality and illegality are thoroughly blurred. Next slide, please. Now we're going to Calabria. This is we are looking at a screenshot from the industrial zone located between the municipalities of San Ferdinando and Rosarno. Again, this is an animation that I hope kind of gives you an idea of how the place has changed, although unfortunately there's not as many kind of the slides don't quite capture the whole period I'm talking about. But so it was, the industrial area was initially intended as a complement to the port of Gioia Tauro built in the 1970s, but it was largely deserted by economic activities. In the 2010s, it became the site of two separate official encampments. First, a container camp established in 2010, which you're not seeing here, then largely abandoned by institutions until its final eviction last month, and a series of 10 cities, of which you're seeing some here, turned into slums by virtue of institutional abandonment, again, as much as of dwellers' reappropriation. Periodically razed to the ground. I counted at least 4 of these operations, but I might be forgetting some, and rebuilt until their latest still standing incarnation. Alternatives were envisaged to what were meant as emergency solutions in the wake of a large and heavily mediatized revolt. the counterposed West African farm workers and the local population. This erupted in early 2010 as a reaction to the physical attacks periodically endured by the migrants. So the camps were a response to that revolt. And the alternative to the camps were meant to be a prefabricated village and a complex of 5 three-story buildings funded by the EU, which were planned, erected, and left uninhabited for years and until now. Also undergoing pillage and, in the case of the other village, occupation by Italian citizens, as well as interruption in their construction due to supposed infiltrations by the local mafia cartels. Other informal encampments and one more official camp, recently built and never inaugurated, are located in other areas of the plain. And I'm not showing you them here because it will take too much time. So in general, while often represented as suspended in a timeless state of emergency, frozen in an eternal present, or stuck in backwardness, like the districts they are part of, these are, in fact, highly dynamic places, both in their function as autonomous spaces for reproduction and mobility, and as sites for governmental intervention and control. But besides the recent history, as the brief descriptions I just gave suggest, they also bear the traces of multiple pasts which haunt them in different ways. It is on those recursions that I want to focus here. Springing on the ruins of projects of settler colonization, land reclamation, penal reform, and military concentration that unfolded throughout the contemporary era, today's encampments bear witness to the ongoing saliency of spatial techniques for the government of mobility, but also of their failures and of various forms of resistance and fugitivity. The symbolic dimension here articulates with other racist and patriarchal mechanisms of differentiation that are in turn functional to extraction. From legal corpuses, their selective application, and the capitalization on illegality they foster, to spatial forms of containment, relegation, and abjection that in turn throw a different light onto mainstream representations of locality. I therefore reframe the concept of made in Italy as a territorialized index of layered and fabricated material, effective and symbolic mechanisms of racialization, exploitation, and differential inclusion that, of course, are also met by various forms of resistance, recalcitrance, flight, and refusal. Just like representations that evoke allegedly remote pasts and faraway places, in its materiality, the spatial dimension immediately summons temporal depth, are perceptible as perceptible stratifications of containment forms are engraved on agribusiness enclaves landscapes, where abandoned or repurposed ruins and rubble, as much as newly built spaces and places, speak of always racialized violence and resistance. Okay, next slide, please. I don't know how much time I have. I spoke for about 15 minutes so far, right?
Yeah, almost 20, but it's fine. You can go
okay.
on. Okay, it's okay.
Right. So I have to rush through this. I mean, again, this is the part of the arguments that I've already developed quite a bit. So it's been published in some form, and I put the reference here. But just to summarize, descriptions of migrant workers' living and labor conditions in Italian agro-industrial districts, which encompass mass media, but also academic, political, legal, juridical, and corporate, effective and popular registers, recurringly summon the trope of modern slavery. Just what the term of comparison might be, the old slavery against which this new form is pitted often remains unacknowledged, but several clues point to the New World plantations as its obscene specters, with their attendant patterns of labor extraction and idioms of resistance. Clearly, the analogy with transatlantic triangulations is lent particular power when applied to capitalist agriculture and racialized Black or brown workers, reactivating plantation imaginaries that may be triggered by a spectrum of affective investments, from indignation and even repugnance to cruel detachment, manipulation and hypocrisy, or even worse, sheer perverse enjoyment derived from a feeling of omnipotence and the powers to subjugate. And I'm here referring to, say, farmers talking to their workers, and calling them slaves, for example. Next slide, please. This is an example of what I'm talking about that I found outside the train station in Rosarno some years ago. So several visual artists have produced portraits of disarticulated, reified, and racialized body parts that you see here. An example of here, that act as metonyms of migrant laborers, indexing their alienation. The same visual trope is found on countless book and magazine covers, flyers, photographs, and posters promoting discussions and analysis on the subject of migrant farm labor. In summoning and even exploiting the specter of extreme form of alienation, carceral discipline, and racial terror that have in American plantations their most recognizable, even primal stage, these depictions at the same time deny workers' very subjectivity, reproducing that fungibility, to use the term that Tiffany Letabo-King employed or suggested, that lay at the core of the enslaved condition on historic plantations. So there's several kind of ways to address the recursions of plantation in the present. There's also, another point to note is that discourses on the need to emancipate enslaved migrants, especially from gang masters, themselves of African origin, and thus scapegoats par excellence. These discourses have profoundly criminalizing and oppressive effects that also echo earlier colonizing policies that were employed also by Italy as a country, as a state in their colonizing efforts. I cannot go into detail because of time, but what I'm trying to do at the same time is to move beyond the by now standard deconstruction of the logics of discourses on new slavery, which has been done quite a bit. And I try to engage with possible alternative genealogies, starting from the long history of enslavement in the Italian peninsula of modern times, which first paved the way to and then reproduced and consolidated racialist ideology. The role of Italian merchants, for example, and rulers across different polities in installing the plantation economy and managing the transatlantic trade is often overlooked and yet important from a cultural, political, and economic point of view, especially if seen from the present and its demands for alternative visions of justice and reparation. And this also helps to better understand kind of patterns of anti-Black that also became anti-Southerner racism in Italy, and that hopefully I'll be able to come back to later. So what is today depicted as contemporary Italian farmers' adherence to New World planters' ethos and comportment, the parallel between farmers and plantation owners, might as well be genealogically traced to farm labor discipline in 19th and early 20th century large estates in Italy itself, where landowners, stewards, overseers, and rent collectors were regularly armed as some farmers or other power-wielding figures are today. Indeed, labor discipline in the capitalist farm estates of early 20th century Tavoliere, for example, has been defined as nothing short of carceral, something that recalls plantation disciplines. References to military-like labor discipline have survived in the now proliferating term caporalato, i.e. gang mastership. And this term has been in use in Italy for at least a century, if not more. Next slide, please. So here we see, on your left, you have a historical picture of some of the workers' quarters in large capitalist estates, especially before mechanization, when you had this kind of very high demand for seasonal labor during wheat's reaping time. And today, some of the migrant farm workers I know still live or occupy the abandoned workers' quarters from old estates, as in the picture on the right-hand side. I mean, it's hopefully somehow clear. I'm not sure. So the veri cafonerie of old, lodgings for seasonal farm hands, mostly employed in the reaping of wheat, suggests analogies with both military barracks and plantations cabins, although the assimilation of large farming estates on European soils to plantations is generally occluded. And this is, of course, except for contemporary discourses that imply the backwardness and brutishness of southern farming. But my attempt here in summoning this recursion of plantation techniques of control seeks instead to situate contemporary agribusiness as predicated on the same needs to channel labor mobility now as before. Although, of course, in kind of mutated context and with partly different techniques as well. At the same time, farm workers' embodied languages of resistance may also be inspired by the transatlantic experience, with references to Rastafarianism, for example, that are very common among West African workers, and foreground potentially alternative conceptions of humanity. Counter-imaginaries of slavery and plantations in terms of marronage are elaborated by African migrant workers in the present. Next slide, please. So here we move to another recursive space in the history of Italian agrocapitalism, the slum. And of course, so today's self-assigned toponyms of the shanty towns where West African migrants live, and especially the name ghettos, are also significant in this respect, in kind of tracing counter genealogies of today's spaces of mobility and extraction. So the term ghetto is drawn from Jamaican English, according to the people I spoke to, via its West African assimilation, indicating a space on the margins of or outside the law, where alcohol, drugs, and sexual services may be purchased, whether in dedicated joints or connection houses, or simply in improvised locations. Next slide, please. So, of course, the term ghetto also exceeds Black Atlantic imaginaries and their Afro-Mediterranean readaptations. This is a picture from the Venice ghetto, of course. While the term ghetto clearly bears North American Black geographical reference as well, that dates back to the early 20th century, the genealogy of the word leads, as most of you know, I'm sure, like those of plantation and slavery themselves, all the way back to 14th century Venice, where the original Jewish ghetto was established, again, summoning the mostly eclipsed Mediterranean prehistories of modern racialized containment. But besides acting as recruitment hubs and devices of spatial segregation, as I already mentioned, in today's agribusiness districts, slums are also knots along migration routes from Africa to Europe, and they might be defined as what Harney and Moten would call undercommons, i.e. spaces of Black fugitivity. Next slide, please. This is a picture where you see the kind of reappropriation of old spaces in new forms. What you see here is the inauguration or the celebration of the construction of a house that was part of a project of land reclamation during fascism. Although this was built by a private foundation, and today these houses are mostly uninhabited, and many are occupied by migrant farm workers. So the criminalization of today's ghettos and attempts at their containment by means of evictions and forms of institutionalization into camps also speak to uncanny historical recursions. Since the 18th century, resettlement projects in Tavoliere were aimed at cleansing the centers of its main agro-towns, Foggia, Cerignola, San Severo, and Lucera, mostly from the farm day laborer population that increasingly urbanized as a result of this dismantling of feudal land's common uses, but also of the increasing demand that this determined for seasonal labor on the expanding extensive capitalist wheat estates. At the turn of the 20th century, landless peasants engaged in a decades-long and rather successful struggle against the agrarian bloc, which fascism crushed violently, as later did the Republican government once the war was over and the struggle took off once more. In a spiral movement, today the ruins of those settlements that were once thought to be the solution to rid urban centers of the unruly presence of day farm laborers, solutions that never fully materialized, have become yet another instance of the same problem. But this is also true of town centers as well. I mean, this idea of having to reclaim the town centers and rid them of the presence of migrant farm workers recurs today as was already present in the 19th and early 20th centuries. I have to, I think, go very fast over the next slides. Next slide, please. These are some of the other constructions, informal kind of farmers' dwellings that were kind of pitted as the backward sort of housing patterns that were to be eradicated by modernizing projects, right? And so these are pictures taken by various kind of reformers and fascist sort of commissioners for the land reclamation. And the last picture you see on the bottom right is the coat of arms of a town called San Ferdinando di Puglia that was established in the mid-19th century. I mean, the coat of arms is later, but and that was meant to rehouse the inhabitants of the nearby salt marshes. But in fact, it was another kind of failed project, and therefore many of the people who were promised a house were instead housed again in the same sorts of structures that they were supposed to get rid of, the pagliaia. So these are straw huts, right? Next slide, please. So basically, since the 18th century, inspired by previous experiments across Europe and beyond, settler colonization was envisaged as a solution against both urbanization, with its attendant biopolitical dangers, and the depopulation of a countryside that instead needed hands. Yet, as I said, plans almost invariably failed their targets and often led to the reiteration of the same problems in new guises. And this is what happened in San Ferdinando di Puglia, as we already saw. Next slide shows you some of the original plans for the town. I mean, it's full of them, like, you know, across different periods of time. But yes, essentially, this was the time when also you have kind of a sort of the consolidation, both of a racist ideology against Southern peasants who are equated, as I mentioned, to Africans, but also of transhuman pastoralism, of nomadism, again, kind of very much in connection to what was happening to African populations to be colonized as well. And so this is the kind of ideological premise on which processes of primitive accumulation, capitalist primitive accumulation, could happen in the Italian countryside, as it were. There's a lot to be said, but just the next slide I think is quite interesting. This comes from the Plain of Gioia Tauro instead, another town called San Ferdinando. Again, Ferdinando was the name of the last king of the last king of Naples before the unification of Italy. So a lot of the early projects of settler colonization were promoted by the Bourbon dynasty that ruled the Kingdom of Naples. And the picture on the left shows you a drawing of the workers' quarters of this new settler colony, again, kind of pointing to the fact that the idea of kind of getting rid of backward structures never quite worked. But I mean, this was explicitly called in 1929 and perfect African village, right? And you see kind of in the same period, this is the picture on the right, what so similar structures were being kind of attentioned. I mean, they were the object of attention also in the colonizing effort in Libya in this specific case. So there is this kind of circulation of images and also the kind of naturalization of certain structures as kind of the proper place for Africans and the equation of Southern peasants to Africans. So it's quite, I mean, peculiar that the same kind of imagery somehow recurs today, right? Because if you look at the next slide, I mean, not only in Calabria, you have now sort of current projects for the rehousing of people who live in the dilapidated camps and informal settlements of the Plain of Gioia Tauro. And you have this explicit reference to kind of building round structures that recall African villages, you know, this kind of generic African village, but also projects for the requalification of the slum of Borgo Mezzanone of Mexico, of which you have an example here. Also kind of use the same imagery. If you see, I mean, all these circular structures that are meant to replace the shacks are explicit references again to what is imagined as the proper kind of African hut, right? And this was, I mean, I was told this much by the person who actually drew up this project. And just, I mean, I think I have to conclude, although there is so much more that I could say about all this. You can maybe quickly.
If you want to talk for another 10 minutes, it's fine, huh? Don't worry. As you wish.
Okay, the next slide is just a bunch of pictures from the archives that show you just kind of how many attempts have been made but to settle the same places. This is about Tre Titoli, the first encampment that I showed you. Actually, the first project to establish a settler colony in Borgo Tre Titoli, well, in Masseria Tre Titoli at the time, it dates back to 1839. So we're still in the kingdom, the period of the Kingdom of Naples before Italian unification. I could find no trace of this in the archives, unfortunately. I mean, would have been interesting to look at the plans, but this was never, in fact, realized. But later, so when the Masseria, the land was acquired by this very rich family that owned it until the time of the agrarian reform, they already tried to enforce a system of sharecropping and parcelize the estate. So sharecropping was used by farmers, like by capitalist farmers, as an easy means to exploit workers, to make them improve the land. So the investment had to be made by workers, and then when the farms were kind of reconverted to kind of higher, I mean, more profitable crops than wheat, then it was time for the owners to get it back. So all the risks were dumped on the sharecroppers, and the gains were for the farmers, the owners. But yeah, so as a general point, settler colonization as a project never quite worked. as it was intended. And there are dozens of examples from both Calabria and, I mean, Calabria is a more kind of, it's a single example in Calabria, but in Tavoliere you have dozens of examples of different attempts at settler colonization that end with the agrarian reform as the last real try. And well, basically, next slide. The point for me is to argue that somehow underlying this idea of kind of reforming workers or kind of improving their stock, because also this became a racial project, especially during fascism, but underneath this idea of kind of giving back the land to landless peasants and improving their life conditions by ruralizing them, lay a profoundly kind of carceral and disciplinary project, right? I mean, people had to be forced in many cases to adhere to these projects. And even when they might have embraced this in a sort of willing way, they were very soon they changed their minds, and they then had to be somehow coerced. Or as you say, they used their feet and they voted with their feet and migrated out. I mean, both Tavoliere and the Plain of Gioia Tauro have had the highest emigration rates in the post-war period, and in the case of Tavoliere, even in the pre-war period. So this was a big concern, of course, also for land estate owners and politicians at the time. And this is one of the reasons why these projects were attempted. Next slides were just further examples. Well, this is the earliest plan you have, the earliest drawing of San Ferdinando in Calabria. This was a project, basically was the initiative of general turned marquis who not only could rely on the labor of people from the surrounding areas to reclaim land that was heavily swamped after an earthquake, but he was also leased dozens and dozens of convicts by the King of Naples. This is a history, this is a story that has not been fully told. And in general, I think the use of convict labor by private enterprise in both pre-unitary and post-unitary Italy is something that hasn't really been investigated. There's few kind of archival traces of this, but I think this is an extremely important and necessary exercise that I'm trying to get to with special reference, of course, to the transition from feudal to capitalist agriculture in particular. And next slide. So the final one, hopefully. So this is a tract written in 1781 by a nobleman who resided on the plain of Gioia Tauro, who basically was among the first to suggest that works of reclamation of swampy land were necessary for the improvement of agriculture, which was a great concern of reformers at the time, but it was to be implemented by convict labor because it was dangerous work that could kill people because of malaria, especially. And it had the advantage of not creating any kind of competition with free workers, because we're talking about, you know, kind of the creation of new land. So it wasn't kind of eating on existing jobs, as it were. And it was also, of course, very convenient for the state coffers, because it was a way to kind of usefully employ, as the guy puts it, convicts that of course were also kind of filling the jails as a result of the process of kind of primitive accumulation and dispossession from the communal uses of the land that they were implied in the transition to capitalist agriculture. And all of this to then conclude that I think there is a last slide, which is, yes, I mean, just a conclusion, which is not the conclusion. It's to point to kind of the recursions. I mean, the ways in which kind of previous projects, I mean, that have characterized the contemporary history of capitalist farming are still kind of somehow impinging on the present. I mean, the carceral dimension of that enables the extraction of labor from migrants is quite obvious, and it kind of works through several means, are, as I said, both spatial and legal and kind of cultural as well. But we can see how kind of this is not something neither exceptional nor totally new, although of course it takes slightly, I mean, it takes modified forms in the present, but the past kind of impinges upon kind of present efforts, as it were. And this is true also of resistance, of course. I mean, I don't want to imply that these are totalizing projects, quite to the contrary. I mean, they're actually mostly failed projects, in fact. Sorry to take so long. Thanks very much if you managed to listen to me up until now.
Yes, we did, and it was beautiful. Thank you, Irene.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm stopping the recording now.